We've got a spreadsheet with quiz questions, and that's being output as JSON data using Google Apps script. So we're connecting to the sheet, constructing an object and outputting it as JSON data. And then using JavaScript in order to connect to that as an endpoint. We've got a little bit of styling there, and using the JavaScript file to connect to that spreadsheet as an endpoint, load that data into some game data, and then add the event listeners in order to create a quiz game from scratch. And this is all with data that's being driven from the sheet object itself. So as you come into the game, you've got the option, got a welcome message and start game. So it asks you the first question. And again, this question is actually coming from the data in the sheet. So if we look at the data in the sheet, it's going to correspond with the question content within the web application. And this is being loaded just with front-end code in JavaScript. So it asks us the question. We've got the questions here on the first column, the correct answer in the second, and then the various options that we have that are going to be presented to the user in the third part there. So we can make a selection. If we get it wrong, we get the feedback right away. And we do see that this was wrong because correct answer was blue. We move on to the next question. And again, this is pulling in data from the Google Sheet. So we select it, we get it correct. We can move on to the next question. And then we have an option. So the questions are done. We automatically, dynamically get the end game button because there's no more questions that are detected here. And we get a score of 2 out of 3. So if we were to add additional questions, and let's add in some additional questions here. And 5 plus 5, so set that to be 10, and set that to be 14. So when we play again, now we're loaded that new set of questions. So we start again with the question, and we've got the new questions. So this is dynamically being pulled in when we load the game. So it's looking for whatever the right answer is. So it's matching that right answer with the user's response. And again, we could get it incorrect. So it automatically does the scoring, and it dynamically updated with whatever amount of questions we have within the spreadsheet. So you can add unlimited number of questions, and they're all going to be loaded into the quiz application dynamically. And whenever it loads, so right now if we press play again, it will requery back to the spreadsheet and load the data from the spreadsheet into the quiz. So we're going to be setting all of that up in this lesson. In the previous lesson, we left off where we've got content coming from the spreadsheet, and we're able to output that using Google Apps script as JSON data and creating an endpoint that we can connect to using our JavaScript code. And right now we're connecting to that sheet data and outputting it into the console as a data object with object structure of question, the correct answer, and an array of possible choices. So we want to take this content, and using AJAX, that we're getting the JSON data from the spreadsheet and output that in a usable format, in a game format that the user can play through, getting the data all coming from the Google spreadsheet. So next step is to build the interface for the quiz application. So we can do that, and we've got content within the output area. So this is where we're going to be outputting the question and then also tracking the results, using that in order to provide input for the user. So providing different screens of output for the user. So now that we're able to get the data in, let's construct our first quiz item. So we want to start by creating a start button that will start the content of the web application. So create that function. And this is going to be the start screen that we're going to be generating. And this, again, once it will be done with Google, with JavaScript. So we'll create the main div container using the document create element. And the element that we're creating is going to be a div. And we're going to append the div to the output screen. And within this div, we'll output some content. So this will be the inner HTML content for the screen. And welcome to the quiz and press the button below to start the quiz. So we provide some instructions for the user. So once the application loads and we're ready, we can load the start. And then let's add in and create a button that we're going to add within that div. And then this button we can use to start the game. So create the button. And using the document, let's create an element. The element that we're creating is going to be a button. And this button will have the text content of start game. And then add the button to the div. So we can do an append of the button to the div. So that gives us the start game button. Let's also add a class. So class list add, and we'll create a style for the buttons. So within the HTML, under the style tags, create a property for button, and then for the button, set it as display, and we'll set it as a block display, so it gets its own line. And then also can do a margin auto to center the button, and maybe a little bit of padding around the text content. So it makes the button bigger. And then also let's do a margin for top and bottom of 10 pixels, and then left and right can be auto. So there we've got the button to start the game. When we click the button, this is where we want to kick off the start of the game. So let's add an event listener to the button. And the button is going to listen for a start. And once the button gets clicked, then we can load the first part of the quiz. And I'll just call it load quiz or load question. So that will trigger the loading of the question. Let's create a function that will load the question. And then we're ready to start loading the content that we've got from the fetch request. So set the load question. And this will just have right now a console log message that will say question when we click it. So we're able to click it. So we don't actually want the button to be clickable until we've actually completed loading the data. So we'll add a function in there as well to select the button and not make it clickable until we've finished loading the content. So in this case, if we want it to have a button, we can load it globally. And then for the button object, we'll set the disabled option to be true. So that will have the button as disabled, so we won't be able to click it, and we only want to click it when we've actually loaded the data in. So set it to be false, and that's going to make the button clickable. So once the data is loaded, we're ready to start the game. So we don't want anyone clicking the button and trying to start the game before that. And we can reuse this button element afterwards as well. And if we don't want to set it globally, we can set it to an object that can be within the init as well, where we can set the button to be disabled so that we don't have to have it as a global object. Pass the button in to the start, and then from there we have the button object that we can then attach to the page. So that will work the same way, where we've got the button object within this scope where we're loading the content and we're ready to start the game. So now when we click the button, the game is started and we want to load the questions. So let's create a global object, and this object will have the value of the question, and we'll start at 0 for the question. And we can also set this within here, so game question, and set that to 0. And let's also set a object value for total. And once we get the data back, so the total is actually going to be within the data array. So the game total is going to be equal to the data length value. And now once we get the content loaded of the data, we can also output the game total. And that's going to tell us that there's 3 questions there that are loaded within the array and that are ready to go. So for the question, we know that we're on question 0 initially. So that's the question that we want to load to start the game off. And then we're going to move through the other questions. So we want to upload and add to the data this content. And we're going to create another object called data. And this is where we're going to load the array. So right now it's just going to be a blank array. And then once the content loads for the game data, we can add in the data object. So once it loads within the game, we're going to have the array of questions that we can go through. So this will make it a lot easier to move through all of the questions. So we can load it from the game object, and once we finish the request and we've loaded the game data from the spreadsheet, and then the rest is going to be just within the front end code. So we want to output that first question to the page. So let's clear the output and set the inner HTML just to be blank. So when we load the question, it's going to clear out the content. And we want to load all of the questions that we have within the data question. So within the main object right now, we've got a game question value of 0. So that can serve as the index value for the game array where we've got all of the question content. So let's clear that content in the console and see what we've got within the game object. So we're on question 0, so that's serve as the index value for the question for the game data that we want to use. So we want to ultimately output that first question to the user. So let's create the main container using the document and create element. And the element that we're creating is going to be a div. So this is where we can contain the main question, and then set up a question object and create another element. And this as well can be a div that's going to be contained within there. And this is where we can add the question to the main output area and then add that question to the div. So we are creating quite a few elements. So what I'm going to do is I'll create a function that's going to make the element. I'll just call it maker. So this is going to make it a little bit easier to make the elements. So we don't always have to doing the same syntax where we've got the document create element. We can just have that within the one value. So within the maker, so we're going to pass in some arguments. So element type. And then this doesn't necessarily need to be a div. So the element type is going to be a div, but we're going to pass that in dynamically to generate that. So creating the element and then the inner HTML of the element. This can just be another argument here within the function maker. So the HTML contents of the element class list. And let's add the class value. So that can also be passed in dynamically. And then we also need the parent that we want to add it to. And let's return back the element that we've just constructed. So to the parent object, and if you do append child, then that's going to return back the element that we just created. So let's try the maker, where we're going to pass in these parameters into the maker function. So to make it a little bit easier, instead of creating elements, so we're going to generate those elements and try that out first here where we've got the const div and passing it into the maker. So we want to use the div, the HTML content that we have is going to be this. So we can also pass in a variable of HTML into there. So we can remove that. The class that we want to add is So this can just be message. And then the parent that we're adding it to is going to be that output. So that can get rid of a few lines of code, simplify the code. So we still got the same output. And now let's set up a class for message. So this can be any of the content that we're outputting. So set it up as width, and let's do 80%, and border, and do a light border around it, do some padding. And of course you can do the styling as needed, and margin of auto for it. So now we've got this type of structure for the message, and we can use the maker function in order to create elements on the fly. So now let's use maker once again to add the question content. So it's a div that we want to make. The HT, there's no content within the main parent, so just leave that blank. This can also go to message and output. And then the second part where we've got the question, we're going to be using maker again. So this is a div, and for the question part, the content is going to be within the load questions. So that's going to be sitting within the game array. So the question content is coming from the data object. And let's output as a variable called value. So this is where we can use the game array and then get the value from the game array, where we can use the game question in order to return back the value. And then within the value, this is going to return back an object. So we can, for now, we can log it out into the console so that we can take a closer look at what the contents are. So see what happens when we start the game. And it looks like we threw an error there. So let's comment that out for now. And let's look at the game object to see what's throwing the problem here. So we do have a game question. So that has a value of 0. And we want to return back from the game. And we don't have a game array. It's actually game data. So try that one more time just to make sure that we're getting the question proper. So there's our question object. So within val, if we want the question, we can do it this way, where this now should return back the question in the console. So what color is the sky? So that's the actual question that we're going to be using. And now we can use that value and send that into the maker function. And we'll keep it as message. And the main container of it, the parent container, is going to be the div that we just created. So there's our question. And just to update this, so use a template literal, and we'll add a question mark after it, so that all of the questions, the code is going to have a question for it. So that's our initial question that we're asking of the user. And maybe we want to create a class for the question as well, so in case we want to structure it. So what color is the sky? And we want to provide the options to the user. So generate those, and that's again contained within the game object. So take a look at the game object. We've got a data of the questions, and then within the array, this is where we've got the listing of the possible options. So let's look through that where we've got the value, and instead of going to the question, we're going to the value array and looping through all of the values. So value array, and then this is where we can use the for each method in order to output the options. And right now within the console, let's just output those options into the console. So start the game. And let's see what we've got. So those are the options for the questions. And I'm actually going to comment out this question. We don't need it anymore. And we can, as we're looping through them, we can create the options and add them to the page. So let's create a option, a list, and using the maker function, creating a div. And then within this div, this is where we want to list out all of the options. So it's just going to be blank content in it. And I'll give it a class of options. And this is also going to be attached to the main parent div. So instead of outputting it into the console, let's create a value for the element. So it's just be a temporary element. And under the maker, create them as a div. The contents of this are going to be whatever we have for the option. So it's going to be the value. And let's add in a class. So maybe we could do a class of box or something like that. And then we're adding it to the option list. So let's see what happens now. So we're listing all of them out as options. And let's create the options for the box. And we'll do a display. And display them as inline block. Also do a border around it. And do a really light border around it so that we can distinguish between them. Add some padding of 5 pixels. Let's see what they look like. So that gives us all of the options that we have. And let's set a width of 25% for them. Also to all of the page, let's apply the box sizing and the border box so that we can fit the full 25 pixels across. So that will, because we're limited to 25, so just keeping them spread out like that. And text align. And center align the text content. So that gives us these options. And we'll text transform to capitalize the content. So it just looks a little bit better, a little bit more readable. And then also for the box itself, so when they hover over the box, can apply some styling here, and we can update the background color. So let's set it black, and then the color can be white. So now when we hover over it, so also set the cursor to a pointer so that it indicates that they are going to be clickable. So allowing the user to make a selection of those elements. So let's also add in and have them as clickable events. So temp add event listener. The event that we're adding is going to be a click. And within that click, we want to check if it's correct or if it's incorrect, and then move it to the next question. So we also want to disable all of these elements with a class of box as well. So we don't want them to be able to be clickable anymore. So once we make the selection, we'll console log out the selection into the console, and we can comment out this one. And then also create a function, remove clicks. And this is going to loop through all of the elements with a class of box and just disable them all. And just call it boxes and do the document query selector all, selecting all the elements with a class of box. And then for boxes, we can loop through for each one and get each one of the elements. So we want to remove out all of the event listeners on those elements. So we loop through them, and using the remove event listener, we're going to remove the click event and then the event that is going to be fired. And we'll just rename that to a function called checker. So within the functions, we'll do checker and pass in, instead of doing the console message, we're going to pass this in as checker. And we need to await now to pass the object information that we've got from the parent into there. So within checker, we can have an object, and then within this object, let's add in some values. So within the opt, we'll just pass in a value for opt. So now within the event object, we can trigger the event target element, get the my object, and then we get the option value. So let's just make sure and double check that it works. And the removing of the elements is also working, the removing of the clicks. So as we loop through the elements, let's apply a style and color value. So do a kind of a grayed out color for the element, so it looks more like it's a disabled option. And we want to remove out the hover effect as well. So let's add in a separate class. We'll call it box1, and we'll add both of those classes to the element. So now temp class list add, and we'll add box1. So that will give us the hover effect. And then what we want to remove is the element class list remove, and the element that we want to remove is the box1. So that will remove that hover effect. So we don't have any more options for the hover effect. So let's update this where we've got the element that we're selecting, and we're going to check to see what the correct answer is, and passing in the answer into the options as well. So we've got that as we're listing through within the game question, and within the game object, we've got the array that we've used. We've got the data there. So we've got the array of options. We've got the question. So we just need to populate the answer. And we can provide that answer within the game. So using val, let's return back the answer as the answer in the checker. So the console log, and just to shorten the content of the object, I'll just call it val, and this will reference the eTarget and the my object, so that we get that all within the one variable. So it's going to be a little bit easier to read. So returning back. So this will have the option that was selected and the answer once it gets clicked. So that time it was blue, the correct answer was also blue. So we're selecting red, the correct answer is going to be blue. So now we can do a condition to check to see if there's correct or incorrect. So we'll do a condition to check if option value is equal to the value answer. And if it is, then this is correct. And if it's not, then it's going to be incorrect. So here we can select the event target and apply a style color, and let's set the color to be green on correct and red on incorrect. So see how that works. So we're removing the clicks. So we should actually remove the clicks first and then run the color update of the selected element. So we got it wrong. It's red. So red is indicating that's wrong. Maybe we want to set the background color. So set the background color of the element to be red, background color to be green. And then for the element itself, style, so set the font color to be white. So this way we get immediate feedback whether it was right or wrong from the user. And then we also have an option to move on to the next question. So we want to add those values as options whenever we do the checker. So there's no more right now to move forward. We can track the score because the answer here is correct. In addition, we can provide that option and the feedback to the user. So let's do that where we're going to add that in. So within the game object, we'll do a score and set the score to 0. So if we get it correct, then we're just going to increase the score. So game score value is going to increase by 1 if it's correct. So let's provide some feedback to the user. And this is where we want to add it in to the parent of the element target. Or we can add it just at the bottom under the output area. So once again, moving back, and we'll get the parent object. So the event target, and we can get the parent element object. So let's console log out the parent. So we're trying to get the full options area. So we want to provide the feedback to the user under the parent. So let's create an object called feedback, an element called feedback. And once again, we'll use the maker function in order to do that. So this is a div. It's being attached to the parent. And we can provide it as a message class. And then the content, let's set up a variable, call it HTML. So set it up just as blank. And then if it's correct, so actually this should be let, because we're updating the string value. So set it as correct. And then otherwise the HTML will be wrong. And this is just providing that feedback to the user. And you can also always update this message as needed. So it'll provide the HTML message and the class of feedback. So let's see what happens. So we get the value of wrong there. And then we also want to have a button to move forward. So just call it button 2. And again with maker, I create a button. And the class of the button will be next question. And the class is button. And then that's is also being attached to the parent. And we need to add the event listener to the button. So we've got the next question there. So to button 2, add event listener. And the event is going to move it to the next question. So all we need to do is go back and run the function load question again. And that will move us to the next part. So click and load question. And then within here, before we move to the next question, we need to update the value, the game question, to the next available question. And this is also where we can check to see if we're out of questions, if we want to finish the game. So let's see how this goes. So red is wrong, next question, loads the next question, correct, next question, wrong. And that should actually, instead of saying next question, the quiz should actually be over. So let's create a response variable. And here we can check to see if the game question value is going to be equal to the game total. And if it is, then our response will be game over and game. And this is a ternary operator. So use the colon there. So question and the colon for the alternative. And this should say next question. So once we come to the end, this should dynamically pick up that we're on our last question. So let's see how this goes. Next question, end game. So instead of loading the question where we've got the load question, we want to do a check to see if we're at the end of the game. And if we are, then we're not going to be loading the question. We're going to be just updating the score back to the user. So let's create a condition to check when we load the question. So if the game question is greater than or equal to the game total, then that means that the game is over. Else and then we can go through the rest of the content as we typically did here for the else. So if it's game over, then here we can just temporarily for now, we can write game over, and we can provide a score back to the user as well. So play through it just to make sure things are working. So we just do end up on the game over. So let's update this to, maybe just call it HTML within this object. And this is where we can calculate out what we want to have for the HTML. So maybe have game over within the h1 tags, and then create a div where we've got some scoring information. So within this div, you got, and then this is under the game score out of, and then the game total, correct, and close that off as a div. So this will provide us feedback on how we did within the game. So you got 2 out of 3 correct. And we might also want to have an option here to play again if we want. So we can create a button here at this point, and using the maker again, create a button element, play again, and then this can use the button class, and the parent of this one can be the div. So play through it, and typically you're going to have to play through it a few times just to make sure that everything is working properly. So it looks like I did load an error there because I got the quotes wrong there. So let's try that one more time and debug it and see if we encounter any issues. So game over, you got 2 out of 3 correct, play again. So let's add in an event for the button. So add event listener. The event that we're listening for is going to be a click. And once we click it, then what we want to do is we want to start the game again. So maybe we want to load the init over again. So click, load the init, and then the init really should just reset all of the values. So we've got the game question, we've got the total, we've got the score, and set all of those to 0. So it's basically resetting the game, clearing out the existing content from the game. And also let's clear out the game data. So just set that to be a blank array. So that'll clear out the array. So ready to load the quiz content again with the play again. So it looks like we need to get rid of that existing content within the init. So let's take output in our HTML, and we'll just clear that and run through it one more time to debug, make sure that everything is working as expected, and play through it a couple times. And now you've got your quiz up and running, and this is with data that's loaded from your Google spreadsheet. So go ahead and create your own version, make some updates to it. You can apply styling as needed and add additional questions within your spreadsheet, and also handle the game logic, adding in additional functionality to create your own version of this game.